The crisp morning breeze swept through the small village of Cedar Valley, where Abigail Dawson was struggling to keep her grocery store open. With the financial crisis affecting everyone, the once fully stocked shelves were now only partially filled. Despite this, Abigail greeted every customer with a warm smile, offering more than just goods, a kind word, encouragement, something to lift their spirits in such dark times. It was a quiet afternoon when Abigail noticed something unusual in the bread aisle. A pair of nervous eyes peeked out from behind a stack of flour bags. Abigail pretended to stay busy at the counter but kept her attention on the small, frail figure trying to move unnoticed. The girl, dressed in faded clothes and with a face smudged with dirt, clutched a loaf of bread in a trembling hand and hid it beneath a coat far too big for her. Abigail sighed. It wasn't the first time someone had stolen from her store, but there was something different about this child. Her eyes weren't filled with malice or opportunism, they were filled with desperation. As the girl turned to leave, Abigail called out firmly, but not angrily. "Hey, little one." The child froze in place, her shoulders tense and her head lowered. Slowly, she turned around, her expression bracing for a scolding. But what Abigail said next caught her off guard. "Why don't you tell me what's going on instead of sneaking things out?" The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked hard, refusing to let them fall. After a few seconds of silence, she took a hesitant step forward. "I didn't want to steal," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't have any other choice." Abigail approached slowly, careful not to frighten her. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Grace," the girl replied, still clutching the loaf of bread as though her life depended on it. "All right, Grace. Let's make a deal. You tell me what's going on, and I won't call anyone. Deal?" Grace hesitated, but there was something in Abigail's voice that felt safe, almost motherly, a voice she could barely remember. After a moment, she nodded, and Abigail led her to a small table in the corner of the store. With a glass of water and some gentle encouragement, Grace began to share her story. She was the oldest of 2 siblings and took care of her little brother, Ethan, who was only 5, along with Tucker, the family dog who never left their side. Her mother, Mary, was gravely ill and bedridden at home. With no one to help them and their food supply running out, Grace had decided she would do whatever it took to make sure her brother had something to eat. Abigail's heart ached. Despite the struggles she was facing with her store, she couldn't ignore the burden this young girl was carrying on such small shoulders. She looked at Grace with compassion, taking her small, cold hands in hers. "Grace, I'm going to your house. I want to meet your mom and figure out how I can help." Grace's eyes widened with hesitation and fear. "You can't tell anyone, please. They might take us away from her." Abigail squeezed her hands a little tighter. "I promise I just want to help. Sometimes, God puts people in our lives for a reason, and maybe I'm here to help your family." Grace was still reluctant, but there was something in Abigail's eyes that told her she could trust her. After a moment, the girl stood and gave a small nod, signaling that Abigail could follow her. The walk was short but silent. Abigail didn't know what she would find but felt in her heart that this was the beginning of something much bigger than she could imagine. When they arrived, Abigail was stunned. The house was a tiny cabin with broken windows and an air of neglect. Inside, the smell of medicine mixed with dampness was almost overwhelming. In the corner of the main bedroom lay Mary, the children's mother, her face pale but her eyes shining with unwavering faith. Mary looked at Abigail and, with a weak smile, murmured, "You must be Abigail. God told me you would come." A chill ran down Abigail's spine. How did Mary know who she was? What role was she meant to play in this family's life? Abigail stood still for a moment, trying to process Mary's words. The small, sparsely furnished room carried a peculiar sense of peace, despite the unmistakable signs of hardship. Mary, though frail, wore an expression of calm that seemed at odds with her dire situation. "How did you know I would come?" Abigail finally asked, finding her voice. Mary took a deep breath, each word an effort. "I prayed. I asked God to send someone to care for my children. When Grace left today, I knew she was being guided to find you." Grace, standing beside Abigail, lowered her head, a hint of shame in her posture. Abigail placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, silently reassuring her that she wasn't to blame for anything. "Mary, what's going on here?" Abigail asked. "You need a doctor, help." Mary slowly shook her head. "There's nothing more the doctors can do. I have a heart condition that requires surgery, and we don't have the money for it." Abigail felt a lump rise in her throat. The thought of a young mother facing death and still worrying only about her children was heartbreaking. "How have you been managing to take care of them?" she asked softly. "It's Grace who does everything," Mary said, her eyes full of love as they landed on her daughter. "She's so brave, so strong, far more than a child her age should ever have to be." Grace bit her lower lip, trying not to cry, just as Ethan, her little brother, appeared in the doorway. He was holding Tucker, the dog, and looking at Abigail with curiosity. "Who's that, Mommy?" Ethan asked, his sweet voice filling the room. Mary smiled weakly at her son. "She's Abigail. I believe God sent her to help us, my love." Abigail crouched down to Ethan's level. "Hi, Ethan. Do you like helping your sister and your mom?" The boy nodded eagerly, his innocent eyes lighting up. "I help Grace feed Tucker. And I give Mommy water when she asks for it." The simplicity of his words made Abigail's heart ache, highlighting the depth of love and responsibility these children carried. "We need to do something," Abigail said, rising and turning to Mary. "I can't leave you like this." Mary closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to reply. "I know my time is running out, Abigail. But I need to make sure my children will be safe when I'm no longer here." The weight of that statement hit Abigail like a blow. She looked at Grace, who was now clutching Ethan tightly, as if trying to shield him from a truth he didn't fully understand. "Do you have anyone? Any family, friends, someone who can help you?" Abigail asked, though she already knew the answer before Mary shook her head. "No. It's just us and God. But maybe you're the answer I prayed for." Abigail felt the ground beneath her feet falter. The responsibility Mary seemed to be placing on her was enormous, overwhelming even. She was just an ordinary woman, struggling to keep her store afloat. How could she care for 2 children and possibly change the course of their lives forever? But then, something stirred within her. A memory of a sermon she'd heard years ago, where the pastor said, "When God calls, he equips. And often, he speaks to you through the needs of others." Abigail sighed, trying to hold back her tears. "I don't know how, but I'll help. Somehow, I'll help you." Mary opened her eyes, gratitude shining through her tired gaze. "Thank you. I knew he wouldn't abandon us." Abigail spent the rest of the afternoon there, helping Grace prepare some soup for her mother and washing the pile of dishes in the sink. Tucker followed her every step, as if he had already accepted her as part of the family. When she finally left, Promising to return the next day, Abigail felt like she had made a decision that would change her life forever. Walking back to the store under the starry sky, she began to question how she would handle everything. But deep in her heart, one question echoed: had God really chosen her to be the answer to Mary's prayer? The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Abigail. Every morning, before opening her store, she made her way to Mary's little house, bringing food and doing whatever she could to help. Grace remained guarded, as though afraid Abigail might vanish from their lives just like so many others had. Ethan, on the other hand, clung to Abigail, greeting her with tight hugs every time she arrived, as if she were the answer to every innocent prayer he'd ever whispered. But what weighed most heavily on Abigail's heart was Mary's calm and resigned demeanor. Despite knowing her time was short, Mary chose not to mourn but to spend her remaining strength praying and saying her goodbyes to her children. One afternoon, while Grace and Ethan played outside with Tucker, Abigail found herself alone with Mary. The room was bathed in the soft glow of light filtering through tattered curtains, and Mary's breathing was slower than ever. Abigail sat beside the bed, gently holding her friend's hand, cold and fragile like an autumn leaf on the verge of falling. "You've been a miracle to us," Mary said, her voice hoarse. Abigail tried to smile, but the lump in her throat made it impossible. "I'm just trying to help however I can." Mary squeezed her hand, surprising Abigail with an unexpected burst of strength. "No, Abigail. You don't understand. God showed me that you would be more than just a temporary help. You're the person He chose to care for Grace and Ethan when I'm gone." Abigail's eyes widened, the weight of Mary's words nearly knocking the air out of her. "Mary. I don't know if I can. I have the store, the bills. I'm not a mother." Mary cut her off with a faint smile. "You have love in your heart. And that's what they need. It won't be perfect, I know, but God doesn't choose the perfect, Abigail. He chooses the willing." Abigail lowered her head, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "But what if I fail them?" Mary took a deep breath, each word requiring an extraordinary effort. "You won't be alone. God will be with you. And I believe you'll do what's best for them." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant chirping of a bird outside the window. Abigail knew Mary was asking for more than she felt capable of giving. But in that moment, looking into Mary's face, she felt she couldn't say no. "I promise I'll take care of them," Abigail said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I will." Mary closed her eyes, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. A single tear slid down her cheek, but her expression held a faint smile. "Thank you. Now I can rest in peace." That evening, as Abigail walked home, the weight of her promise pressed heavily on her chest. When she stepped through the front door, her husband, Daniel, immediately noticed her distress. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, but he set it down the moment he saw her red-rimmed eyes. "Abigail, what's going on? You look devastated." She sat down at the table, unable to hold back her tears any longer. "It's Mary. She's dying, Daniel. And she asked me to take care of the kids." Daniel sat quietly for a moment, letting the gravity of her words sink in. He knew his wife had a generous heart, but this was far more than either of them had ever faced. "Abigail, this isn't an easy decision. You know that, right?" "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "But, Daniel, they have no one. Grace is practically raising her little brother on her own, and Mary, her faith is so strong she truly believes God sent me to help them. I promised her I'd take care of them. Daniel leaned forward, taking her hands firmly in his. Then we're going to have to trust God for this too. If you made that promise, Abigail, we'll figure it out together. His support was like an anchor for Abigail. For the first time in days, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could do what Mary had asked of her. But as they braced themselves for what lay ahead, Abigail couldn't help but wonder, how do you say
goodbye
to someone like Mary while welcoming a future so uncertain? The air felt heavier in Mary's small home the next morning. When Abigail arrived with a basket of fresh bread and warm soup, she was greeted by Grace, her eyes swollen from tears. The girl said nothing, simply took Abigail's hand and led her to her mother's room. Mary was even weaker than the day before. Her breathing was shallow, and her face was a pale shadow of the person she once was. Still, when she saw Abigail enter, a faint smile appeared on her lips. "You came," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here, Mary." "I'm with you," Abigail replied, sitting by the bed and taking her hand. Grace and Ethan followed closely behind, and Mary's eyes welled with tears as she saw them. She reached out a trembling hand for Grace, who rushed to kneel beside the bed, clutching her mother's frail fingers. Ethan, too young to fully understand, rested his head on Mary's lap, while Tucker lay at the foot of the bed, sensing the gravity of the moment. "My loves," Mary began, her gaze tender as it moved between her children. "I want you to know that you will never be alone. God will always be with you. And Abigail," she paused, turning her eyes to Abigail, as if imprinting the moment in her heart. "She will take care of you." Grace began to cry quietly, her shoulders shaking, while Ethan looked up at his mother, confusion in his innocent eyes. "Mommy, you're going to be okay, right?" he asked, his voice trembling. Mary cupped her son's face, tears slipping down her cheeks as she tried to steady her voice. "My sweet Ethan. Mommy won't hurt anymore. I'll be with Jesus, and he will take care of you, just like Abigail and Daniel will." Abigail felt her throat tighten, but she stayed calm, knowing she had to be a source of strength. Mary turned her gaze back to Abigail, her eyes filled with peace. "Remember the promise," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I remember, Mary." "And I'll keep it," Abigail said, her voice trembling with emotion. Mary closed her eyes, taking one final, deep breath. "Thank you," she whispered, her body relaxing as silence filled the room. Grace let out a loud sob, clutching her mother's hand tightly, while Ethan looked up at Abigail with wide, confused eyes. "Mommy's just sleeping, right?" he asked, his innocent question breaking Abigail's heart. Abigail pulled him close, holding him tightly in her arms. "She's with Jesus now, Ethan. She loved you so much, and now she's in a place where she feels no more pain." The boy rested his head on Abigail's shoulder, while Tucker let out a low, mournful whimper. Abigail's heart shattered, but she silently vowed to honor the promise she had made to Mary. In the days that followed, Abigail and Daniel focused on organizing Mary's funeral. It was a modest ceremony but deeply meaningful. The few remaining neighbors in the community gathered to pay their respects, and the local pastor delivered an emotional sermon, highlighting Mary's unshakable faith and her trust in God until her final breath. After the funeral, Mary's home felt emptier than ever. Abigail knew she couldn't leave Grace and Ethan there. With Daniel's help, she packed the children's few belongings, a small suitcase of clothes, Ethan's well-loved teddy bear, and Mary's worn Bible. That evening, Abigail and Daniel brought Grace, Ethan, and Tucker to their home. The transition was difficult for the children, especially for Grace, who looked around as though she were in unfamiliar territory. "This is your home now," Abigail said gently, trying to sound as welcoming as possible. "I know nothing can replace your mom, but I promise we'll take care of you." Grace nodded but said nothing, her face set in an expression of quiet determination, as though she were trying to stay strong for Ethan. Abigail prepared a simple but comforting dinner, and the whole family sat together at the table. Before eating, Daniel said a prayer, asking God for strength to face the challenges ahead and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to care for the children. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Abigail stayed downstairs, lost in thought. On the coffee table lay Mary's Bible, and Abigail opened it at random. Her eyes landed on a verse that seemed to speak directly to her heart. "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress." James 1 verse 27. Abigail closed the Bible and took a deep breath. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew God was with them. As she looked up toward the staircase, where Grace and Ethan were sleeping, she couldn't help but wonder, would the children ever truly feel like they belonged in this new home? The first days at Abigail and Daniel's home were a blend of hope and challenges. Grace, despite her forced maturity, kept her guard up. She seemed wary of Abigail's kindness, as though it might be temporary. Ethan, on the other hand, adapted quickly. He followed Daniel everywhere, eagerly helping with small chores and cheerfully calling him Uncle Daniel. Even so, the pain of losing Mary surfaced in unexpected ways. One morning, as Abigail prepared breakfast, she found Grace sitting on the kitchen floor with Tucker, clutching the dog as though he were her lifeline. She was silent, but tears streamed down her face. "Grace, is everything okay?" Abigail asked, kneeling beside her. Grace looked up, her eyes brimming with grief. "I just miss her," she murmured. Abigail pulled her into a hug. At first, Grace resisted, but then she gave in, her sobs coming in waves. Abigail stroked her hair, whispering softly, "I know you do, sweetheart. And it's okay to feel that way. We'll get through this together, all right?" Outside the home, the community of Cedar Valley began to murmur. Some people didn't understand why Abigail and Daniel had taken the children in. "They've got enough problems with the store," some said. "How are they going to support 2 more mouths?" Abigail tried to block out the comments, but they cut deep. The store was struggling, after all. The economic downturn had driven away many customers, and the shelves were emptier than she'd ever seen them. Daniel felt the pressure too, but instead of complaining, he worked harder, taking on longer shifts at the store and cutting costs wherever he could. One Sunday at church, the pastor addressed the situation directly, making a special mention of Abigail and Daniel. The example of this family reminds us of what James, chapter 1, verse 27 teaches: to care for orphans and widows in their distress is the true expression of faith. May we support them and learn from their compassion. Some in the congregation were moved by the message, but others continued their quiet judgments. As Abigail was leaving the church, she was approached by Helen, a well-meaning but tactless neighbor. "Abigail, I admire what you're doing, but do you really think you can handle it? Wouldn't it be better for the children to be with a more prepared family?" Helen's words made Abigail's blood boil, but she remained calm. "Helen, God placed this path in front of me, and I trust that He'll provide what I need to care for these children." Preparation comes from the heart, not just the wallet. When Abigail recounted the conversation to Daniel that evening, he sighed and pulled her into a reassuring hug. "People will always have something to say, Abigail. But what matters is what we know in our hearts. We're doing this because we feel it's right, not because of anyone's opinion." Despite the difficulties, small moments of hope began to emerge. One afternoon, Grace, who had mostly kept her distance, surprised Abigail by offering to help in the store. "Can I organize the shelves?" she asked timidly. Abigail, caught off guard, smiled warmly. "Of course you can. And you know what? You get to decide how to arrange them. I trust you." Grace lit up at the opportunity and threw herself into the task, carefully arranging the goods and even cleaning neglected corners of the shop. Customers that day complimented the neatness, and Abigail saw a spark of pride in Grace's eyes. Meanwhile, Ethan grew increasingly comfortable with Daniel, especially during their Sunday mornings tending the garden together. One day, as Abigail watched Ethan chasing Tucker around the yard, Grace quietly said to her, "He's happy. It's nice to see him smile again." Abigail placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. "And you? Are you starting to feel at home?" Grace hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "I don't know. Sometimes I think I am, but other times, it feels wrong. Like I'm forgetting about Mom." Abigail knelt to meet Grace's eyes. "Your mom always wanted you and Ethan to be happy, Grace. Being happy here doesn't mean you're forgetting her. It means you're honoring the love she had for you both." The words seemed to reach a hidden part of Grace's heart. She nodded slowly but didn't speak. That night, as Abigail and Daniel finally prepared to rest, a loud and unexpected knock on the door startled them. They exchanged worried glances. "Who could that be at this hour?" Daniel muttered, rising to answer. Abigail's heart raced as she followed him to the door. Was this a new challenge? And what would it mean for the fragile new family they were building? Abigail's heart raced as the phone call from social services echoed in her ears. She stood behind the counter of the store, clutching the phone tightly, while Daniel watched her from across the room, sensing something was wrong. "Mrs. Dawson," the voice on the other end began, "I wanted to inform you that a distant relative of Grace and Ethan has come forward. They're expressing interest in taking custody of the children." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "A relative," she stammered. "Yes," the voice replied. "They've filed a petition for custody. We're obligated to investigate their claim, and depending on their background and ability to provide for the children, they may be considered a suitable placement." Abigail's grip on the phone tightened. "But these children have just lost their mother. They've started to settle in here. Taking them away now would only traumatize them further." "I understand your concern," the social worker said calmly. "But family placement is always a priority when possible. Of course, we'll keep you updated as the investigation proceeds." When the call ended, Abigail felt like the world had tilted beneath her feet. Daniel approached her, concern etched on his face. "What's going on?" Abigail turned to him, her voice trembling. "They found a relative. Someone who wants to take the kids." Daniel froze, processing the weight of her words. "What does that mean? Are they just going to take Grace and Ethan without even considering what's best for them?" "They said it's just a petition for now," Abigail replied, tears welling up in her eyes. "But if the relative is approved, they'll have a strong case." That evening, Abigail and Daniel sat with Grace and Ethan in the living room, deciding it was best to be honest with them. Grace sat stiffly, her hands gripping the edges of her chair, while Ethan played with Tucker, blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. "Grace," Abigail began gently, "we need to talk about something important." The girl's eyes narrowed, a mix of fear and suspicion creeping into her expression. "What is it?" Abigail took a deep breath. The social worker called. They said a relative has come forward, someone who wants to take care of you and Ethan. Grace's face fell, her voice breaking. They're going to take us away from here? Not necessarily, Daniel interjected. It's just something they have to look into. But we're going to fight to keep you here. We love you and Ethan, and we want you to stay. Grace looked down at her lap, silent for a moment before whispering. What if they don't let us stay? Abigail leaned forward, placing her hands over Grace's. Then we'll fight harder. But no matter what happens, Grace, we'll always be here for you. You'll always have a home with us. Grace bit her lip, her shoulders trembling as she held back tears. Abigail pulled her into a hug, while Daniel gently patted Ethan's head, silently vowing to protect their fragile new family. Over the next few weeks, the investigation moved forward. Abigail and Daniel worked tirelessly to gather letters of support from the community, detailing the stability and love they'd provided for Grace and Ethan. The pastor wrote a heartfelt letter, vouching for their character and the effort they'd put into caring for the children. To their surprise, some of the same neighbors who had doubted their decision initially began to rally behind them. One morning, Helen, the neighbor who had questioned Abigail's ability to care for the kids, stopped by the store. Abigail, she said awkwardly, holding out an envelope. I've been thinking about what you said, and I want you to know I was wrong to judge you. This is a letter for the court. I hope it helps. Abigail was stunned but grateful. Thank you, Helen. This means more than you know. One afternoon, as the family sat in the backyard watching Ethan play with Tucker, Grace spoke up. Why do you care so much about keeping us here? She asked Abigail. Abigail turned to her, startled by the question. Because you and Ethan are part of this family now. Your mom trusted me to take care of you, and I'm not going to let her down. But more than that, we love you. Both of you. Grace's expression softened, but she still seemed uncertain. Do you really think we're supposed to be here? Like, God wants this? Abigail nodded firmly. I do, Grace. Sometimes God puts us in hard situations, but He always has a plan. And I believe His plan for you includes staying here with us. For the first time, Grace didn't look away. She held Abigail's gaze, her walls beginning to crack. Okay, she whispered. But just as Abigail and Daniel began to feel hopeful, another call from social services brought new complications. The relatives' background check had cleared, and they were pushing for a court date to determine custody. As the hearing loomed closer, Abigail knelt beside her bed one night, clutching Mary's old Bible. God, I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, she prayed, her voice breaking. But I'm trusting you. Please, protect Grace and Ethan. Help us keep them safe. The fight wasn't over, but Abigail knew one thing for certain. She would do everything in her power to give Grace and Ethan the home they deserved. Abigail gripped the phone tightly as she listened to the calm yet serious voice of the social worker on the other end of the line. Mrs. Dawson, we've encountered a complication. We've discovered a distant relative of the children, a maternal uncle named Henry Williams, who has expressed interest in taking them in. The news hit like a punch to the stomach. Abigail felt her knees weaken as she tried to process what she had just heard. An uncle? But Mary never mentioned any relatives. She said there was no one. It seems they've been estranged for many years, the social worker explained, but he recently contacted us. We're required to evaluate him as a potential guardian before moving forward with your custody or adoption process." Abigail tried to keep her voice steady, but her unease was evident. "The children have been with us for weeks now. They're adjusting, putting down roots. Wouldn't this be confusing for them?" The social worker hesitated. "We understand your concern, and it's clear that you and your husband have been doing everything possible to care for Grace and Ethan. But our protocol prioritizes biological relatives as long as they're deemed suitable." Abigail hung up the phone, the words biological relatives take priority echoing in her mind. How could someone who had been absent through all of Mary's struggles suddenly appear and claim these children? Daniel found Abigail sitting at the table, staring blankly at the forms they had barely started filling out. He approached, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What happened?" he asked. Abigail explained the call, and Daniel fell silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think this uncle really wants the kids, or is he just doing it out of obligation?" "I don't know," Abigail sighed. "But just the thought of Grace and Ethan being taken away, it feels like we're losing a battle we haven't even started." The news of Grace and Ethan's uncle left the children uneasy in the days that followed. Grace, who already struggled to open up, became even more withdrawn, while Ethan innocently asked questions that broke Abigail's heart. "Who is this uncle? Does he like dogs? Will he take us to a new house?" the boy asked one evening. Abigail knelt beside him, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Ethan, I don't know exactly what will happen, but I promise we'll do everything we can to make sure you and Grace are happy and safe." The boy nodded, his trust in Abigail unshaken. Meanwhile, the financial strain on the grocery store continued to grow. It was the family's only source of income, but profits barely covered expenses. Abigail and Daniel were exhausted, juggling the demands of the store and the emotional needs of the children. One day, while Grace was helping organize the shelves, an older customer, Mr. Coleman, noticed the girl working. "Is she your daughter, Abigail?" he asked with a warm smile. Abigail hesitated but answered firmly. "In my heart, she is, Mr. Coleman." The man nodded, appearing deep in thought. "You know, Abigail, I've always admired your dedication to this community. It's not easy running a business during times like these. And now, with these children, it takes a lot of courage and faith." Before Abigail could respond, Mr. Coleman reached for his wallet and said something that left her speechless. "Consider this a gift, for you and those kids." He handed her a check. Abigail looked down at the piece of paper in her hands and felt tears well up in her eyes. It was a generous amount, enough to restock the store and cover the initial costs of the custody process. "Mr. Coleman, I don't know how to thank you." He smiled kindly. "Thank me by helping others, like you always do. God always provides, Abigail." When Grace learned about Mr. Coleman's gesture, she seemed genuinely surprised. "Why would he do that for us? He doesn't even know us." Abigail smiled, placing a hand on Grace's shoulder. "Sometimes God works through people in ways we can't imagine. This is proof that he's looking out for us, even when things feel like they're falling apart." A few days later, Abigail and Daniel were informed that Henry Williams wanted to meet the children before any decisions were made. The meeting was scheduled at Abigail's house, and the tension in the air was palpable. Grace seemed more tense than usual, while Ethan clung to Tucker as if the dog could protect him from whatever was coming. When Henry arrived, accompanied by a social worker, he appeared polite but slightly uneasy. Abigail greeted him with a firm handshake, while Daniel poured coffee. Grace, however, could barely bring herself to look at the man. Henry began by explaining how he regretted losing touch with Mary and wanted to make amends by stepping up for Grace and Ethan. He talked about his stable home and how he could provide everything the children needed. "But do you know Grace and Ethan?" Abigail asked gently but firmly. Henry hesitated. "Not as well as I'd like to, but I'm family." Grace finally spoke up, her voice trembling with emotion. "My family is here. With Abigail and Daniel." Her words hung in the air, and Henry seemed taken aback. For the first time, he appeared to truly see the bond Abigail had formed with the children. The meeting ended, but the fate of Grace and Ethan remained in the hands of social services. Would the emotional connection Abigail had built with the children be enough to outweigh Henry's claims? Or would the court prioritize blood ties above all else? Abigail held the phone tightly as she listened to the calm yet serious voice of the social worker on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Dawson, we've had a development. A distant relative of the children, a maternal uncle named Henry Williams, has expressed interest in taking them in." The news hit like a punch to the gut. Abigail felt her legs weaken as she tried to process the words. "An uncle? But Mary never mentioned any family. She said there was no one." "It seems they were estranged for many years," the social worker explained. "But he recently reached out to us. We need to evaluate him as a potential guardian before moving forward with your custody or adoption process." Abigail tried to steady her voice, though her unease was evident. "The children have been with us for weeks. They're adjusting, finding stability. Wouldn't this only confuse them?" The social worker hesitated before responding. "We understand your concern, and it's clear that you and your husband have done everything to care for Grace and Ethan. But protocol requires us to prioritize biological relatives as long as they're suitable." That evening, the house was quieter than ever. Abigail watched Grace and Ethan sitting on the couch, Tucker curled up between them as if guarding what was left of their fragile emotional security. Grace was more withdrawn than ever, her face set in an expression of doubt and fear. Daniel sat beside Abigail, placing a hand over hers. "Do you think we've done enough?" he asked softly, careful not to alarm the children. Abigail looked at him, her eyes tired but resolute. "I don't know. But we've done everything we can. The rest is in God's hands." That night, after the children went to bed, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with Mary's Bible open in front of her, searching for solace. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages until she stopped at a verse that seemed to shine like a beacon of light in the darkness. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Jeremiah 29 verse 11. She took a deep breath, letting the words sink into her heart. Daniel, who had quietly entered the kitchen, placed a warm cup of tea beside her. "He has plans, Abby. Even when it feels like we're losing, God is working behind the scenes." Abigail nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. But I'm scared, Daniel. I don't want to lose them." Daniel wrapped his arms around her, offering the comfort only he could give. "We'll trust him, like we always have." 2 days later, Abigail received a phone call from social services. Her hands trembled as she answered, with Daniel and the children waiting silently in the other room. The social worker's voice was calm but carried a note of finality. She explained that the decision had been difficult. Henry, as a biological relative, had the right to claim custody of the children, especially given his stable circumstances. Then her tone shifted. However, the social worker continued, Henry contacted us yesterday and said he's decided not to pursue custody. After meeting you and the children, he believes they already have the home they need. Abigail was silent for a moment, struggling to process the words. He gave up? Yes, the social worker confirmed. He said it was clear how much you and your husband love them, and he believes this is the best decision for Grace and Ethan. We'll move forward with the legal custody process for you. Tears streamed down Abigail's face. Thank you so much. When she hung up, she turned to Daniel, who was holding Ethan in his lap while Grace watched from the corner of the room, her face filled with anxious anticipation. They're staying, Abigail said, her voice breaking with emotion. Grace's eyes widened. We're staying? Here? With you? Abigail knelt in front of her, taking her hands in her own. Yes, Grace. This is your home now. For a moment, Grace stood frozen, as if waiting for something to go wrong. But when she realized it was real, she ran into Abigail's arms, sobbing in a way she hadn't since Mary's death. Ethan, still too young to fully understand, let out a joyful shout and threw himself into Daniel's arms, Tucker barking excitedly around them. Abigail and Grace held each other tightly, sealing the promise of a new beginning. Over the following months, the family adjusted to their new life together. Abigail and Daniel navigated the complexities of the adoption process, but the support from their community made everything feel lighter. Mr. Coleman's generous gift allowed them to restock the store, and new customers began to appear, drawn by the kindness and resilience of a family many had come to admire. Grace, who once carried the weight of the world on her young shoulders, began to blossom. She helped regularly at the store, interacting with customers and even smiling now and then. Ethan, as energetic as ever, continued to shadow Daniel, calling him Dad with growing confidence. One evening, Abigail found Grace sitting with Mary's Bible in her lap. "What are you reading?" Abigail asked. Grace looked up and smiled. "Just a verse that reminds me of Mom. She used to say that God would never leave us alone. I think I finally understand what she meant." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "And she was right, sweetheart. He never left us." A few months later, on the day the adoption was officially approved, the family gathered for a simple but heartfelt celebration. Grace and Ethan now shared Abigail and Daniel's last name, and the weight of uncertainty had been replaced by a deep and abiding peace. That evening, as they sat together for dinner, Grace looked at Abigail and said something that made her heart overflow. "Mom, thank you for not giving up on us." Abigail tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply smiled and held Grace's hand, while Daniel hugged Ethan tightly. As the family sat together, Abigail glanced out the window at the starry sky and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something God had planned all along. Have you ever witnessed a miracle in your life, something that seemed impossible but became a new beginning through God's grace? Share your story with us in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and help spread this message of faith to more hearts. This is Narratives That Embrace. Stay with God, and we'll see you in the next story.